Hey there, welcome to Inside the Wooniverse, a podcast brought to you from the corner of Fringe and Maine. I'm your host, Colette Baron-Reid, and welcome to another episode of our limited edition series called Spirit and Recovery. Now, joining us today is a most extraordinary human being, Tammy Valicenti. Tammy is a psychotherapist who specializes in trauma recovery and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is a mouthful. And otherwise, that's known as EMDR. Now, Tammy has over 25 years of experience in working with clients to achieve relief from trauma, anxiety, and panic, and is the founder of Transformation Solution, a system that utilizes a synthesis of EMDR, internal family systems, and other evidence-based therapies to achieve radical, life-changing results in a short period of time. And I'm going to tell you something right now. I'm going to out myself because I have personally worked with Tammy on stuff that was stuck for like 40 years. And I can attest to the fact that some huge changes happen in a very short period of time, as well as subtle, and they're continuing to. So I am a huge believer in Tammy and what she does because I've had personal experience, and she's a very interesting guest to have. So, Tammy, welcome.
So excited
Welcome.
to be here, Colette.
Very excited that you're here, and we're in a very different dynamic this time. You sitting in that chair, me here, and we're
Yeah,
not doing therapy.
it's great. It's great.
It's awesome. So I want to know a little bit about you. What your childhood was like, and when did you actually become interested in healing, being a healer, and
Mm.
and then of course, because you developed this system that is quite extraordinary. So I really want to know your origin story about this.
Excellent. I don't. Do you know any of my history? I don't know if you do,
No.
but I'll start from the beginning. For me, it wasn't wanting to do this work wasn't something that started in my head. I kind of knew it.
Right.
It's not a job or a career. It was a calling, and that started. I don't know, grade school, maybe middle school. I wanted to be a child psychologist. I didn't have a concept really of what that was. I didn't know any. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it had to be done.
Wow.
Um, yeah, right.
And then
And
how did that play out?
so the road was a little bumpy at first, but I went to UMass Amherst undergraduate, studied psychology, then went to Columbia Graduate School. I actually avoided addiction and recovery.
Interesting.
Right. Well, I have a history in my family, so I come to trauma and addiction honestly, but
Yeah.
I I didn't know that that's where I was headed in my adult life, so I kind of avoided that. But my first love really was trauma. I started working at an organization in New York City that specialized in working with women and children who were dealing with domestic violence and specific population, people with disabilities and domestic violence.
Wow.
And then I was running a rape trauma program on Long Island in New York and realized I can't do this work without understanding addictions. So I did
Right.
a lot of that work too. But like I said, I come by it really honestly. Like I had my family history is my dad was alcoholic. He uh, was also a survivor of really significant trauma in his childhood, and then as a teen was fighting in Vietnam. So I'm a secondary survivor of trauma and an adult child of an alcoholic.
Yes. Okay. So let's dial down a little bit more, drill down on the idea of the word trauma because it's become
Yeah.
quite a buzzword. I've also come to all of this honestly. I had trauma, what I know to be true, et cetera, that still impacted me in my 60s. That happened to me when I was 19. So
Mhm.
I would really love us, if we could, to chat about what is trauma. What does it really mean? How would we describe it? And how does it impact us when we don't have the tools or the capacity to deal with it? Because we do have collective trauma and then individual trauma. Let's talk about that since we're all talking about it these days.
Right, hot topic. So, the one of the ways that I define trauma is very broad based. I think we are all survivors of some sort of in quotes trauma. Trauma being anything that overwhelms our ability to cope.
overwhelms our ability to cope. So if
Mm-hmm.
something overwhelms our ability to cope, it could be trauma from an event. It could
Mm-hmm.
be trauma from an action. Can we, make it a little bit more accessible?
Sure. So,
It would be
so an example.
negative, right? Obviously.
Obviously, right. Right,
Something
and
bad happened.
something bad happened, and we can't cope. So it could be something really significant that we all think about as trauma, um, a plane crash, or childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, those sorts of things. But then
Hmm.
we can get really down to the nitty gritty and wonder, when I was in second grade, I wasn't. This didn't really happen. But if I was in second grade and a boy came up, shoved me, called me names, is that trauma? I'm not sure. It really depends on the person's individual experience. But if in that moment I felt a lot of shame and I pushed that down and there was a part of me that was frozen in that time,
Hmm.
yeah, that was traumatic for me. And I kind of build my psyche around that now.
It's funny because I always thought trauma just meant like blunt force. You know what I mean? That
Mm,
something actually happened to you physically, or, like the idea that you had an event. In my case, there was a lot of violence in my 20s. But I came to recognize that, that overwhelming inability to cope. Actually, I can think of an instance when my geography teacher, Miss Prestwich,
right.
reminded me that we weren't really Canadian because my parents were immigrants. My parents had really heavy accents.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was Serbian and my mom was German, and although she was Polish, German national. Anyway, so they had like really, really super heavy accents, and yeah, and she was like, "You're not really Canadian." And I remember leaving then and shoving two big donuts in my face and then vomiting, and that was the beginning of my bulimia.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
really think that that comment that was on her case just benign. She was trying to basically school me in what it means to be really Canadian because they had been there since I don't know, since first settlers came, which they forgot to mention that the First Nations people were here first,
Mm-hmm.
but it was this whole it felt traumatic, but I didn't see it as trauma. But
Mm-hmm.
it absolutely changed a lot of how I saw myself and how a sense of shame and unworthiness became part of the fabric of my psyche.
Right. That's a perfect example because trauma typically happens when we're not connected. There's a sense
Right.
of, right, of othering or being alone.
Hmm.
9/11 happens and you'd expect more people to be traumatized. That wasn't the case. We all went through it together. You see droves of people walking across the bridges together. There's touch. There's a shared mutual experience. In your experience, in that classroom, she othered you, right? You
Yeah,
did that
really.
alone. Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
interesting. Because
Mhm.
it did, and when I started working with you, well, I mean, I started diving into the idea of trauma because when you work with people, as I do, you have to really acknowledge their stories. You can't
Mhm.
really genuinely work with people or try to help them discover their authentic path or help them transform unless you really understand the nature of their experience.
Yeah.
So, understanding what someone has gone through has to be part of the dynamic you're talking of because not there's no such thing as one size fits all.
Mm-mm.
You have to take those things into account, which
Mhm.
I think is why this movement has become so popularized right now, that the idea of trauma informed therapy, trauma informed coaching, trauma informed, you know what I'm saying? So that
Mhm.
it's this is a big thing.
Mhm.
And when I reached out to you, it was because I had realized that I had actually not dealt with an incident that had happened amongst many, as you know, I won't go into the detail here, but that it was still impacting my reactions, my expectations. Yeah,
Right.
as an adult woman, as I was seeing the very same dynamic play out in different ways with other people, and thought, wow, it's time that I go deal with this. And so, can we talk about how trauma exists in the body,
Mhm.
how the story sits somewhere in the body? Because that's what I learned working with you.
Right. I think there's a lot of different ways to talk about that. We can talk about it on about a biological level. We can talk about that on a spiritual level. Maybe let's
Let's
combine
talk
that.
about all of
Let's
it.
yay, yay,
Let's go
yes.
through the list.
All right. All right. So on a biological level, really what's happening is you're activating your sympathetic nervous system, right?
Right.
So our breathing is deeper and heavier and faster. Our heart rate picks up. Blood sugars kind of go through the roof. And if that trauma isn't lasting, we come back down to parasympathetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is easy breathing, digestion, things are operating the way that they should. But when we're activated biologically, oftentimes, if we're in an environment where we're activated and reactivated, that we'll just stay at that level,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Can we talk about an example of that? So when
Mm-hmm.
we're in an environment where we get activated or reactivated, is that environment somehow um, energetically consistent with or echoing the feeling state that we had in the initial traumatizing moment, right? Like this
Mm-hmm.
reminds me of that, therefore I'm in a heightened sense. Or is it that you get into that heightened sense of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, attach, and then the other stuff comes up too. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a lot of things happening. It can be that you're in an environment where you're constantly being activated. So you grew up in a
Right.
home with a raging father, right? And you're right, you're walking on eggshells, you're hypervigilant, so your heart rate may be higher at all times. You know, you may be not
Mm-hmm.
fully in parasympathetic um, all the time. Or if you're talking about a one-off incident, maybe when you were younger or a teenager, and then later on an adult, I think this is maybe a little bit more what you're talking about, that you're reactivated as an adult and you're feeling
Right.
all of that over again. So even in the moment, you're like, this isn't terrifying. I'm okay. I'm safe, but my body is freaking out. What's going on?
Right.
Right.
Or
Right.
you don't even recognize the difference between the two because your feelings tell you that you have to, seek out the potential threat. And even though intellectually you know that that's it, but you don't think intellectually because that's cut off for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just gone. I want to just go into something I think is really interesting that I think we could talk about because I want to come back to that. But I
Mm-hmm.
came across this book, Shattered Assumptions by Ronnie Janoff Buhlman.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, she shares the three fundamental assumptions that people generally hold. And I want to talk about how trauma can shatter one or more of these beliefs. So we typically hold that the world is benevolent,
Mm-hmm.
the world is meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
and the self is worthy. I found that fascinating because these are three things that can be very elusive too. So
Yes.
but we're born with these ideas. So let's talk about how trauma can shatter that and define it really, um, because I think so many people will identify with the conversation, and I really want to get it to, you know what I'm saying, so that people can identify with what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think the book sounds brilliant, but then the concept's amazing. Right. We're born into this world feeling worthy and feeling safe, and that the world is, like you said, a benevolent place. Um, it's the experiences in childhood, the experiences in adulthood that layer on top of that make it difficult for us to find that true, capital S self, or that aligned with, I don't know, call it what you want, source, God, divine place. But
Mhm.
we're all born so pure and in that place. But again, all of those experiences provide layers on top. Sometimes we have a hard time finding that. So we
Mhm.
may walk around, the world is an unsafe place. People are out to get me. It might not be a conscious thought, but our nervous system is wired that way because of
Mhm.
experiences that we were born into, right? We weren't born that way for sure, though. You're
Right,
right, right,
right. So
right.
because there's a default setting that is good, that is healed, that
Mm-hmm,
is open, that is safe.
mm-hmm,
Um, and I think, we've been all of us been exposed to sustained uncertainty for so long with the pandemic and then with the war, in Europe, and then all the, climate change. Like there's you name it, we can just tick off all the list.
mm-hmm.
So, I want to kind of talk about how the individual experience of somebody, say, for example, who knows that they've experienced trauma, haven't really dealt with it. And then after a long period of sustained uncertainty, what that does
Right,
and how
right,
we can recover from that.
right. So I'm sure you could guess, and a lot of listeners know already, what that does is activates us, triggers us. So where does that bring us? Maybe we have less tolerance
Hmm.
for whatever in the world. So we're anxious. We have increased impulse control. We're using alcohol and drugs more. We're eating more. Um, Did I mention sleep?
No, we should be talking about
We
sleep.
should be talking about sleep. So having difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, not getting enough sleep shows up as depression.
Uh-huh.
Right? I think we're just more susceptible to all of those things. And if anyone has a significant history of trauma, living in the world right now feels really uncomfortable.
And unsafe, right? It just feels, and you can't
Yeah.
put your finger on why. There's
Right.
just a sense of like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's, I love the science behind everything. So let's talk about EMDR therapy because I'd love to talk about, options for help, right? And I know for me, this was so extraordinary. I mean, yours transformation solution is a number of different modalities, but I did find the EMDR fascinating. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about the science behind it because there is help. We don't have to all of us wander around as a collective, looking for potential threats everywhere we go. We really can heal. If we can
Right.
identify this, there's ways in which we can get help. So let's talk about that.
Right, absolutely. So EMDR, like you said, stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was a technique invented 35 or developed 35 years ago by Dr. Francine Shapiro. And she noticed that when she moved her eyes back and forth and thought about something disturbing, that it became less disturbing. And she got really curious about that. And out of that, she developed EMDR. So it was, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, it was just a technique. Now it's a full-blown therapy used for everything, not just trauma and PTSD, but even upper limiting. I can tell you story upon story of working with folks who, because of their history and negative beliefs about themselves, not necessarily any significant trauma, but just
Right.
a part that was kind of ostracized
Mm-hmm.
and put aside because of something that happened when they were younger. Again, not necessarily trauma, but that upper limiting of like, I'm not good enough to do X, Y, and Z, and really holding oneself back. EMDR
Mm-hmm.
is really effective with things like that. I don't know if you want to get into like about what the science is behind that or what a session would look like.
Both.
Oh, great. All right.
This is about you and it.
Fantastic.
Let's
So,
do it.
I mean, as you already know, EMDR, what's great about it is it's not just a cognitive therapy. It works with the whole body and it's a holistic system based therapy. So, in session, we're talking about an experience and we're remembering it with maybe a visual memory, but
Mm-hmm.
most important, and that's almost an aside, most important is what are the sensations in your body, Colette, and what are the emotions that go with it? So we pair all of those things together, and for good measure, we'll throw in a negative belief about yourself, and then we pair that with some eye movements back and forth, or taps back and forth, sounds in your ears back and forth, and then through that, the transformation and the reprocessing happens. We can really take that memory that's still super activated in the present. When you can bring it up and you can heart races or you feel embarrassed or your face flushes, we can really take that memory and at the end of the processing or reprocessing, it will not activate you anymore. You can think, all right, that was a really, really shitty experience. And I remember how awful that felt even when I talked about it, but I don't feel that anymore.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. But I also
Mm-hmm.
found that spiritually, like here's what happened with me.
Mm-hmm.
So, that all happened, that was true, we did that, we tapped on my leg, etcetera, and we brought those things forward, and then what I started noticing is that the outer world, and I wonder if it is because of, how the reticular activating system of the brain takes our eyeballs and looks for evidence in the outer world that what our new feeling state is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
So, without going into too much detail, but, I'll bring up what happened with this particular person that was involved in a violent experience that had brought me a lot of shame in my early 20s. Out of the blue, this man, sends me a Facebook request to be my friend right in the middle of our therapy. Remember that?
I
That
do.
was like,
I do.
oh my God. And then I realized I didn't care anymore. That was the most incredible. Like, what would possess this person to
Mm-hmm.
send me a friend request on Facebook
Mm-hmm.
when it was incredible. Like, rapist is asking you to come and be friends. I'm like, oh my God. but it was like I didn't feel a thing. And
No.
I actually went and looked at his page and his brother's page, and I was like, these
Uh-huh.
are just old men now, like that I could care less about. And I can tell you prior to that, now
Yes,
I can
yes.
talk about it because I think it's worth talking about,
Yes.
because I kept that inside. I never even told anybody about that. I could tell anybody about these other things that happened to me because I wrote about them in my book. So this is common knowledge.
Mhm.
And it was related to my alcoholism and drug addiction at the time,
Mhm.
my early 20s. But I never talked about this one incident because it brought me so much shame. And the fact that I literally, and it still did like 2 years ago, and the pandemic brought it to me and said, you know what, Colette, it's time for you to clean house, like really
Mhm.
clean house.
Mhm.
And then I came to you like quivering. I have this one thing that happened, but
Oh,
I
you were
haven't told
so
anybody.
courageous. So
Right.
courageous.
And then all of a sudden this happens. It was like the universe went, okay, let's see how far you've come. And I'm like, what
Yeah.
the heck? Like so this stuff really works. And it works. For me, it was the last house in the road. Right? It's that kind of thing that, okay, I've tried everything, talk therapy, I've done all these other things, but sometimes a trauma, especially if it's shame-based, and because we are talking about the, spirit and recovery, where, this limited series is also about recovery from addiction.
Mhm.
So, and I definitely believe that is specifically for women, and I can't speak for men because I just know myself as a woman or anybody who identifies as a woman. There are certain things that I can tell you by having been in a women's treatment center that we had all been sexually abused. All of us had had experiences that brought trauma around, the loss of boundaries and just a tremendous amount of thing that no matter where we came from, because we were there from all walks of life,
Yep.
we had the identical story. And I
Yes.
found that more and more in 12-step rooms when I got clean and sober, and I've been
Mhm.
sober now 37 years. So
Mhm.
it's like, I with this is a thing that's in common. It goes hand in hand with addiction.
It
So,
does.
and the shame, and it never left me. Like
No.
it
No.
never left me.
No.
So, and I didn't want to tell anybody. So it was just really interesting. And now I'm just so a fan of this because we
Mm.
didn't talk it through. I didn't need to tell the story again. I needed to do something that
Mhm.
could take it out of my body. And I didn't know that's what I needed. I just know
Mhm.
well, like mutual friends that we all share you in common. You work with a lot of us. And it really changed my life. So
Yeah.
I want to talk about the spiritual aspect of it. And then I'd love to hear your take on that because
Mhm.
I had a spiritual awakening during the session. And
Mhm.
what had happened was it was very similar to an out of body experience where I could see I was in this big giant house and this child version of me or this little part of me was there and I could actually see it, and it was a mystical experience while we were doing that, and I felt that at a spiritual level it was bringing me back to the core of innocence, the core of the connection to spirit, because what happens when we continue to hold trauma in our bodies, we don't 100% connect with spirit. There's still this little disconnection because we think, well, this part of me can't, well, that's just always going to be a scar or a wound. And yet when I released it, I had more greater access to spirit, greater access to source, greater access to my creativity. It was
Yes.
like
Yes.
was incredible. So I
Yes.
want to hear your take on that, and and the spiritual. I would love to hear like your take on the spiritual aspects of trauma that's unhealed, and then when it's
Mhm.
healed, like
Yeah.
with because you have a lot of clients besides me.
Yeah. That was a beautiful summation of your experience, and that's exactly what happens as you heal those parts and really pull fear out of the system. You're able to more fully be connected to spirit, to self, to divine. Um, I think a big part of that is, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, a big part of that work is, and that's where the IFS piece or the parts piece comes in. Yes, deactivating your nervous system helps, and getting rid of that fear does help in that connection. But the other piece is getting in connection with the part of you that's been exiled off, that was too shameful to talk about it. That,
Hmm.
right? So we bring her out of hiding you connect with her, you have the compassion and the love and the understanding, and you're able to give her everything she needs and then bring her to where she needs to be, whether it be in the present with you, having this interview with me, or to that beautiful, mystical, magical house that she lives in, right?
Yeah, it's trippy. It
Right?
was really amazing. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so the internal family systems piece, because I do want people to hear that too, that it's not just I'm going to shift it out of my nervous system and get rid of
Hmm.
it, because there's a
Hmm.
story attached to it. I think also, if we could segue into this other conversation that's also become quite popular, which is working with ancestors.
Mm.
This was something that my mother went through too,
Yeah, of course.
which I had found out, and she had told me never to tell anybody. She's crossed over now, but there was a lot of secrets growing up, and my mom had been through the World War II, as had my father, and a lot went down. Plus, we didn't even know we were Jews. My mother's father was killed in a concentration camp in Dachau. So there was a lot of family history that was
Hmm.
trauma
Yep.
based that I didn't know, but I had it in my body when I was like, I had it. I grew
Yeah,
up with
it's in
it,
you, it's
not
in your
knowing,
DNA.
right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
So
Hmm.
in a weird way, having done this, I feel like I set my mom free. Like I do you know, it just feels so different.
Absolutely, you have. Absolutely, 100%. Her story is a little different because you were able to shift your DNA as well. The
Mm,
remarkable thing about this is that it's not just deactivating. When you're kind of touching the issue a little bit. You get to retell the story.
yeah.
So that's the remarkable thing about the EMDR and that combining it with the IFS piece is that we get to retell it. So it's not just that in your instance that this awful thing happened to you and you had no control over it and you were a victim of it. No, through the reprocessing with EMDR and then getting you out of that, you retell the story. So now
Mhm.
I don't remember the exact details, but now I'm powerful. Now I have agency, right?
Yeah, now I have agency.
Right.
And I no longer am afraid of the part of me that didn't, nor am I consistently looking for similar experiences today, although they wouldn't be exactly like that. They're much more actually, more implied. I
Hmm.
don't need to keep doing it over and over again trying to find healing. It is healed. So I'm not even vaguely attracted to that energy anymore,
Hmm.
which also is confusing. Like why are these kind of people coming into my life challenging me? It feels just like that. And then
Right.
I realized, well, maybe, oh, that's interesting. But I think also uh, having, like you said, going there and telling the new story. I think what we have to all be very careful of, and this is just my opinion because I went through this myself, and I see it in clients. I see it, also with just in the rooms I'm in and the Facebook groups we run. That the story of being victimized versus victimhood. So
Hmm.
we experience many of us have experienced a situation where we have been victimized either by one-off event, by society itself, by family, by experiences that become a story that we tell. So the difference of telling the story about victimhood,
Hmm.
right, which is where I am identified as a victim, is very, very different than saying, yeah, I was victimized here and this is what I did to change that, and I am
Right.
not that person.
Right.
That's
Right.
really important to remember, not to be attached to the victimhood, because I am noticing, since trauma has become quite a popularized topic,
Hmm.
that people are loosely using the term to say, "Oh, that's my trauma. Oh, that's my trigger. Oh
Hmm.
my God, you triggered me. Oh my God." Like, do you know what I mean? Instead of like, okay, so,
Right.
right, let's
Right.
be responsible for this.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, I had teenagers these days. I had PTSD from that. I can't do that." I think you're really, really diminishing it for sure. Right,
Right?
right. Let's have a little deference for people who really have PTSD or have experienced some things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also to note that there is real genuine help to be had.
Hmm.
It's
No
and
doubt.
that news story is available. That's the thing. It empowers you. And as a result of doing the psychological work,
Hmm.
you automatically have greater access to spirit. Like you say, like you just do.
Yeah.
Your intuition it turns on, your creativity, your capacity to trust.
Hmm.
Where you just, like, I always thought that I was trusting. I had a tremendous amount of faith. I do this work, the spiritual work, blah, blah. But that was one thing I just figured, well, that's just always going to be there. That's just
Yeah.
there,
No, not
and
the
then
case.
instead, no, And then I
Yeah.
thought during the pandemic, like, well, why don't I change this too? Like, why don't I go deal with this thing that sits in my throat that makes me want to
Yeah.
vomit when I think about it?
Right.
Like,
Right.
right? I think I'm going
Yes.
to go do this now.
Yeah, yeah. And it also doesn't have to be a thing that someone remembers. There have been many times I've worked with folks like, I've got this feeling like I'm not sure. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the feeling? You said it's like a vomit in my throat. All right, we'll go with
Yep.
that feeling in your body. And then the emotions that go with that. Let's tap that through and see what comes up and where that goes. And also what you're talking about, Colette, is like it's really about connection. It's
Yeah.
in those moments we were disconnected. In the classroom, when you were traumatized by
Mm-hmm.
this man, we were disconnected from ourselves and from others. And this sacred place that we create, you and I have done, allows you to connect more to yourself and to spirit and divine.
Okay. Circling back on the point I mentioned earlier about the 3 assumptions we have about life and how trauma shatters our belief in them. How do you know when the EMDR has done its job and healed the trauma? Is it now about being able to hold those 3 beliefs or assumptions again? And could that feel like a miracle unto itself? And do you have any stories? Like, because I know we can't name names, but
Sure.
I'd love to hear some of the stories because I just shared mine because it really was astounding, like
Mm-hmm.
astounding. Like I could
Yeah.
even fantasize, bring up those people in my head, and now I just like, who cares?
I just
That's
love that.
impossible. Like, that's just impossible.
Oh, I'm so grateful every day I get to do this. You have no idea.
Like totally, it's impossible that those things could have been. I mean, my
I
whole
know.
life that's been hiding in the back of my head.
I know. Did you find yourself looking for it? Like, where did that go?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. People
Well,
do that. Yeah.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know what it did though, too? Like it made me feel more grounded.
Mm-hmm.
Like in
Mm-hmm.
the weirdest way that had nothing to
Mm-hmm.
do with that. Like nothing
Mm-hmm.
to do with the exact thing, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel much more rooted. I would say I'm more rooted in my
Yeah.
being. Nobody
Yeah.
can pull me up by the roots anymore.
No, you have more connection to the core of you.
Yeah. That I can tell you. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that I only started noticing it when I started painting and well, I mean, I didn't start
Mm-hmm.
painting, but it showed up in my art, which I
Mm-hmm.
found fascinating because I'm like, wow, I feel like a different person.
Amazing. So
Wait a
great.
second. How is
That's
this possible? Yeah. So, okay. So let's go there. Like, so how does that work? And then let's talk
mm-hmm.
about some stories that you know that you're
Okay.
able to share.
So I guess what you're asking is how does someone know when they're done with their
Right.
work, with their EMDR work? And I think it really depends on person to person. A lot of people come in with specific things like,
Yeah.
and this is going into a little bit of a story, but of someone I worked with. But someone came in. I've got tinnitus, and says, I've done some research, and EMDR can help. I'm like, really? You're sure? So I actually did
Really?
some research, and I think
Did
he
it
was
work for
right.
tinnitus? No
It,
kidding. My Mark has tinnitus.
yeah.
We'll send him to you. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Did it work? I want to hear.
So 3 sessions, there's relief, sleeping through the night,
No.
Yes, yes,
No.
yes, yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
The panic related to it is gone. The tinnitus is still there a little bit, but it recedes to the background. So,
Wow. Okay.
right.
This is meant to be this
Mhm.
conversation. Okay. This is so
So,
interesting.
so does that person feel like they're living in a benevolent world, that they're feeling safer? I'm not sure if all of if those what was the third thing you mentioned?
The self is worthy. The world is
Worthy.
meaningful. The world
Yeah.
is benevolent.
Yes. Yes. So I don't think necessarily in that quick sessions, 3-session treatment, like all of that happened. I think maybe that person came to me with all of that in place mostly,
Right.
and it was just this kind of one specific thing.
And what about somebody else, for example?
Someone comes to me, I want to stay in self when I go back and see my family of origin. When I'm around
That's
my
a
sister,
big one.
right?
Yes. Let's talk about that. How did that work?
Good question. So,
Because that's like, yeah, like Thanksgiving, Christmas, all kinds of different,
oh
family
man.
occurrences. What happens when one has an entire panic attack when you go in the house? I used to eat an entire thing of chocolate chip cookies at my mother's house because I couldn't be there without shoving food in my face.
Mm-hmm.
And this is back when I had an eating disorder, but I just couldn't go.
Right.
I just had to eat my way through the whole time.
Right, right, right. And it's a lot of times it's really hard to stay in self. We regress back to that,
Hmm.
petulant, angry child or whatever we were at that time. So how does that go? That definitely goes to what was it like to live in that house growing up? What were the interactions with your sibling and with your parent? And maybe no big T traumas as we've defined them per se, but there was a
Hmm.
diminishment of self. That person maybe wasn't seen and heard.
Right.
Right. So we work on that with EMDR and the IFSC piece as well. And lo and behold, that person setting clearer boundaries, can sit at a
Right.
dinner table without regressing. Can they spend a whole week in a vacation home with their family without losing it? Probably not.
Right.
But who'd want to do that anyway?
Right, exactly. I mean, it's yeah, yeah, I get that. I really get that. Has anybody ever talked to you besides me about my spiritual awakening, which was just so shocking? Has anybody talked to you about, about how working with you or working with your technique at the transformation solution has
Mhm.
impacted their spirituality specifically?
Mm. I know that happens almost on a daily basis. If I'm thinking
Right.
about something specific. In fact, even yesterday, my first two sessions, it was all spiritual. It was
Hmm.
conversations and processing around connection to self and where is that for me. And that's where I feel, speaking for the client, that's where I feel most myself and okay. And how do I find that? And how do I
Hmm.
stay in that? I keep getting pulled out by all of these forces.
Yeah, by all these forces that are external to us, and I think that that's key, that whenever we're disconnected from spirit, which I think is our greatest the
Yeah.
greatest wound that all humanity has right now is our disconnection from spirit in all
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
But yeah, we get pulled away from the self with a capital S.
I can think of one instance. A woman came to me, wasn't sure if there was sexual abuse in her history. And again, we don't have to know. It's just the sensation in your
Mhm.
body um, and the emotions that go with it. Lo and behold, some visions, some memories come up. Though that's not typical with EMDR, even if you have a sense, it's very rare that it will uncover some memory. But it did, and that was processed. And I think 3, 4 sessions, and then after
Mhm.
that, she comes back. She's like, I just had this experience. I had sex, and I was present, and I enjoyed it, and I was grounded, and again, three, four
Right.
short sessions, and if that's not a spiritual experience, I don't know what is.
Yeah, because when we come to ourselves, it is
Yeah.
much more is available to us. That's interesting too,
Hmm.
because when people have that history, it's really easy to disconnect in the act because you can't put two and two together. You can't put love with sex together. It becomes this kind of strange bridge that you have to eventually build.
Hmm. Hmm.
Question: can the strides be made within the realm of healing trauma with EMDR ever be reversed, or is it permanent?
Great question. It is absolutely 100% permanent.
Yeah.
So the results you see, people ask that all the time. So, right, and
Yeah.
and 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 there's fear around it, right? Like,
Yeah.
am I going to lose this feeling? Is this going to go away? No. The
I
answer is
thought
no.
that.
Right?
I completely thought that, and I went looking. I actually remember I said that, that person, sends me a Facebook friend thing. I'm like, "What? No."
Hmm.
But it was so interesting because I actually made myself dive in and look at the pictures, and I couldn't make it come. And then
No.
I actually brought myself to the memory of the event, and I couldn't make the shame come. Like, it
No.
just wasn't there. It
No.
was like, wow, I'm just looking at this dispassionately,
Yeah.
disconnected completely. I get what happened. I totally saw what happened. I feel more compassion for me at the time and and I mean, like being the victim of something like that is, but I don't know. I didn't identify with it. I was just like, wow, that was a shitty thing that happened that actually made me who I am now. And I couldn't force it. Like, I was just
Right. I
because I
love that.
didn't, I was like, is this real? Is this like
Yeah.
really gonna go away now? Like, is this? And
Yeah.
I will tell you honestly, it feels permanent. It
It
does.
is. It is. It is. I mean, reprocessed and deactivated that memory, but also you freed that part of yourself that was
Yeah.
exiled off, and she is now a part of you. Like you said, that experience was part of me, but it is not me, right? And it's not activated.
Right.
So yes, you reintegrated that part that was cordoned off, that was jailed by that experience.
And I like
Mm-hmm.
that you use the word exile, because I think that many of us
Mm-hmm.
exile that part of ourselves. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a way to say safe. I can't connect to that, but it doesn't work, because then you keep repeating and keep being attracted to, which you would never intellectually be attracted to these things. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's the eyeballs. We keep noticing the evidence in the outer world that we're not safe, or that somehow
Right.
some event could create shame in us, or like it's a
Right.
very interesting thing. It's very,
Yeah.
very interesting. I find it
This,
fascinating.
yeah, I mean, even though you've exiled or cordoned her off, because of that, she has so much power. It's when you bring her closer and integrate her with you
Yeah.
that she has less power over you.
So let's talk about the inherent gifts
Mm-hmm.
of that self that was traumatized. What are the gifts that reside in trauma and in the healing of trauma? Because I know that it did feel like there was a part of me that was stuck, like frozen in amber. That I
Yes.
couldn't forgive, that I was ashamed of, that I took on, it was my fault. And,
Mm-hmm.
which is very typical too for women who have addiction issues, who find themselves in in patterns of sexual violence and things like that, which
Mm-hmm.
happened to me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I can say to me now, because it's like, well, I participated in that, but I realize that no shame here, and no
Mm-hmm.
shame. This is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
This is who I became, and this
Mm-hmm.
is what I can offer now.
Right. So
Mhm.
the gifts, beginning with, you've unblended from that part, right? And you're not weighted down by the shame of it.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Specifically, just on a PTSD level, folks are then able to sleep better. All of those things. But I think
Yep.
the bigger, greater gifts are less. Certainly, you're less symptomatic. But the bigger, greatest gifts is that you walk around whole, and there's a freedom in that, right?
And more compassionate, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think people develop that you can have more compassion, because you all of a sudden, that one part of you that you've disowned
Mm-hmm.
is now something you can care about.
Right. It started with compassion with, for self and that part, right? That maybe you would
Yeah.
have hated or shamed or raged at or disliked.
Yeah.
But as you got to know her, you could have a lot of love and compassion for her and bring her close and just give her all the love and things that she needed that she didn't have. And so, the other gift is that we're able to be more connected
Mhm.
to each other, more connected to source, connected to family, to friends, connected to self. That's
I
where it
think we can't
starts, right?
really genuinely have all the connections to friends and families, and well, that's not true. I think we can be connected, but the connection to self with the capital S, that higher self, is that you get connected to the blueprint of why you're here. Your real contributions, your authentic desires, as opposed to
Yes.
the things you think you should have.
Right.
You're not looking for clues in the outer world to tell you if you're okay or not, or to tell you what you should be doing. You just inherently know, and that's why I
Mhm.
think this relationship between spirit and recovery from trauma can actually bring you even deeper to your spirituality, deeper to the core of why you're here, and also I think that healing of fear. I think the pandemic and then the war brought a lot of fear back to people.
Mhm.
It certainly, I mean, I'm glad it happened to me, because that's why I went and got help from
Mhm.
you. Like, I
I
better
am
deal
too.
with this
I am
thing
too.
that's come up. Like,
Right.
wait a second, this happened 40 years ago. Why am I thinking about it every day now? Like, that's not normal.
Well, at that moment, that
Right.
was your highest spiritual teacher, right?
Totally. Oh my God. But that's the thing. So let's talk about that. How
Yeah.
trauma can be your best spiritual teacher, how
Sure.
it calls you. I
Mhm.
mean, it brought me to my knees and called me to the
As it
table and say,
can.
okay,
Right.
right?
Right. If
If
we
you
if
want to
we
be,
listen, if we
sorry.
don't run
Mhm.
from it, if we don't hide from it, exactly. Our highest, greatest spiritual teacher. Follow the
Mhm.
calling. Mhm. Mhm.
Follow the calling. So, what do you love most about the work you do besides
Oh,
meeting
it's
me?
hard to say. That is a number one, top of my list. Oh, I've gotten into podcasts lately, and these are really fun. But I have to
I know
tell
you were on
you,
Gabby's. You were on
I was,
Gabby's.
I was.
Yeah, we share you.
And I did Aviva Roms. I don't think that's been aired.
So cool.
I've got another one coming up, I think tomorrow. I love doing this work. It's super fun. Most importantly, I want the word to get out to folks who are suffering or, carrying the weight of things like this. And you just don't have to. It's just not necessary.
And it's not that complicated.
I was going to say,
the other
it's an easy fix.
It is, which is shocking to me
Mm-hmm.
because I love to complicate things. I love complexity. I love things that take forever. I love like all these, and then when I got here, it was like, well, that was easy. What the heck is that? Why have I waited so long? And how is it true that it was easy? Wait a minute. Now there's got to be something wrong with
There's
this.
a catch.
I mean,
There's
literally,
a catch,
there's a catch. I was looking for the catch.
No catch.
Like, how come this was happened like this? Oh yeah. I was like, I'm obsessed now.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because afterwards I realized, well, I've really done this part. And then I'm like, what else could I do? What else could I work with next?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to come back to you now. I've got a whole new list of things that are not necessarily trauma based, but perhaps a ceiling that I'd like to move beyond. But it is so true that there are tools, and that's why I wanted you on this series, because I want people to know that there are tools and they are not hard and they're not hard to find.
No.
And they work.
They do.
They work.
They do.
And I am living proof that they work. So thank you for being here. Let's pull a card together to see if there's anything else the Wooniverse wants.
So excited for that.
Now, I chose the Oracle of Seven Energies because it operates off of the seven spiritual components of a person's life experience. It's also the seven psychological concepts that we work through, and basically seven categories that life is made of. So let's pick a topic and see if we can riff on one more thing.
Great.
Oh, that came out. So let's take that. Okay. Well, this is too easy. It's called Into Me I See.
Are we surprised?
Come on. Are we surprised?
Not at all. Into me I see.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to just read you a little bit of an excerpt from the guidebook.
Okay.
And
before you read that, can I just because it just touches on something you asked me before, which is, what do you love about your work? I mean, it's the podcast. Yes, it's really fun, but it's the moments, and you've experienced this with me. It's the sacred space between the two of us that we create, right? And those moments of like, aha, or like, holy shit, something shifted.
The holy shit piece, yes.
There's nothing on this planet or any other planet I'd rather be doing. I'm jazzed by it every freaking day.
Yeah, and it is amazing. It is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
So here's what it says. At certain precious moments, you're called into a deep and meaningful connection with the world or another person. I'm going to cry now. A magical affinity arises with the kind of intimacy that in turn encourages a greater understanding of yourself. The relationship acts as a mirror, helping you see your own patterns. What it reflects about you can further your own personal evolution. Intimate relationships hold up a mirror of truth and reveal more treasures than you might ever expect. If you can look into it, take a risk and see everything is beautiful. Even in its imperfections. Imagine how deep you could go. That's what I wrote.
That's the card. That's the actual card. That's unbelievable. Crying. Oh, that is so beautiful and so perfect. So perfect. This is sacred work we do.
Yeah. And we need each other. It's the sacred work you and I get to do, but also this is what everybody needs. We need more intimacy. We have become so divided and so much division everywhere, and we need to come together. And no matter whatever it takes for us to do. And if anybody listening here that has had any kind of trauma, any kind of past experience that, we know there is help. We know that it can be done. And what you get at the end of it is the capacity for connection in a way that you've never had before, because I know it's true for me.
Yes, absolutely true. Bravo.
Oh, to learn more about Tammy and all her other offerings, you can visit her at transformation transformation-solution.com, transformation-solution.com, and to find a transcript of this episode, quotes, and links to what we've been speaking about here today, head on over to our show notes page at itwpodcast.com or click the link in this episode's description. Tammy, what a great conversation.
Oh,
Thank you.
so grateful for you.
Oh, ditto. Thank
This
you
is
so
so
much for
fun.
joining. And I really hope the listeners heard this today. And if, it works, it really, really works. Don't wait
It does.
40 years like I did
No,
to
not
deal
another
with
minute.
something.
Don't wait another minute.
Go do it.
Yes.
It works. It
Yeah.
works. Oh, what a great conversation. What did we learn today, all of us? Well, oh my gosh. Well, we learned so much. And of course, I am a huge, huge supporter of this kind of work because it actually works, because I know it works. But the spiritual piece here, when we pulled the card Into Me I See, which is exactly what this is about. We become so disconnected from ourselves if we don't deal with our, genuine trauma that we've experienced, whether it be PTSD, whether it be a number of things, that she calls the little T or the big T, or just the things that prevent us from being fully, wholly connected to one another and to, of course, spirit. But this does open up our connection to the universe where everything does become possible. I just loved talking with Tammy Valicenti today. So until next time, I'm Colette Baron-Reid. Be well.